Today, we have added the Secretary of State, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, the NASA Administrator, the head of the Forest Service, and the President's personal assistant. We have gone to the big wall and 3 columns. Anybody else going tonight? There needs to be a new director of the CIA as well. And now tonight, the National Security Advisor is out, too. And so, yeah, we're going to need another wall soon.
Hi again, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in New York. One of the hallmarks of the first Trump administration was our friend and dear colleague Rachel Maddow and her wall, her giant wall, keeping tabs on and listing all of the many people who left the White House under Trump, often under duress, often fired after a blow-up, many of them unceremoniously fired on Twitter by the ex-president himself for not giving him exactly what he wanted. We share that blast from the past, that time capsule with you, because this time it's not clear that Rachel's going to need a wall, and maybe not one that big, because Donald Trump is now surrounding himself with the kind of people who would never have any tension with him, the kind of people who only say yes, people whose only qualification for the kinds of jobs they're getting are that feature, that fact, that they're loyal only to him, not the Constitution, not the expertise once associated with the agencies they've been tapped to lead. Just take the most recent cabinet picks: a Fox News weekend morning show anchor to head the Department of Defense, a former Democratic congresswoman who publicly spreads Russian talking points, who has been now tapped to lead the nation's spy agencies, and a man who was the target of a years-long federal sex trafficking investigation to lead the Department of Justice. And of course, the breaking news we just brought you in the last hour: a world-famous anti-vaccine activist, Robert Kennedy Jr., to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Of course, the choices still have to come to pass, either bypass Senate confirmation or, by some ultimate humiliation of the Republicans in the Senate, be confirmed by the Senate. But as the New York Times editorial board writes, quote, Trump clearly expects the Senate to simply roll over and ignore its responsibilities. He wants to turn the leaders of major important agencies into his deputies, remaking the federal government into a Trump Inc. org chart entirely subordinate to him. He recently demanded that the Senate give him the ability to make recess appointments, a way of bypassing the Senate's consent process when the chamber is adjourned for 10 days or more. And it's not just the positions at the top of the agencies that Trump is filling with unqualified yes men and women. He has threatened to purge these departments of civil servants who he believes are not loyal enough to him. The Republican Party has already demonstrated over the last 9 years that they almost always let him have his way with whatever his attention demands. Here's Congressman Troy Nehls of Texas yesterday, right after Trump spoke to the House Republican caucus.
Donald Trump he was in there. Everybody loves listening to him. He could have sat in there for another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and we'd all be listening attentively. He's the greatest thing since sliced bread. If Donald Trump says jump 3 feet high and scratch your head, we all jump 3 feet high and scratch our heads. That's it.
At least they admit it now, year 9. It is sort of a helpful feature. So we're going to forget about the Constitution, the guiding principle of the country and the Republican Party, and replace it with Donald Trump. Liz Cheney warned us we are slow walking into autocracy, although at the rate this week is going, it looks more like we are running. It's where we start the hour with the host of the Rachel Maddow Show right here on MSNBC, New York Times bestselling author, my colleague and dear friend, Rachel Maddow's here. Rachel, where to start? You go.
Well, I don't know. I don't know where to start. I mean, I do feel like, Nicolle, that you, maybe more than anyone, has been very clear-eyed about what was coming and about what was being promised here, and that there was no reason to expect this to be moderated or normal, or that this is going to tack back toward the center or towards anything that looked like traditional American politics. I mean, you did your Autocracy in America series, and listen, we saw what was going to happen, and now it is happening. And so I do feel like this is a moment for people to get real and for people to stop saying, like, oh, this is going to end up being much more moderate than anybody expected. When are you going to stop? So when are you going to start apologizing for saying that democracy was threatened? I mean, I think it's time to get real and realize that this is really what we're up against. But I also think the fact that we all feel a little bit, I don't know if flummoxed is the right word, sort of rocked by the increasing incredulity of these choices, is that it is meant to shock us. It's meant to adjust our sense of what is normal, what is possible, and to sort of so disorient us as to what it counts to propose governance in the United States that we're ready for the most radical pronouncements and actions. And I do think we're supposed to feel the way that we do right now. I think that's part of this. It's a shock and awe campaign against American traditions and mores. And that's, I think, how most of the country feels about it.
I mean, I think to sort of sustain the military analysis, the Iraq war starts with a shock and awe bombing campaign. The war is a catastrophe. I mean, it doesn't connote competence. It doesn't signal that he will succeed in successfully demolishing American democracy. It does mean that we as a press still, every single time, chase the shiny object. And this week, the shiny objects are named Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK Jr. Next week, they'll be named, or maybe by 9 o'clock, they'll be named Steve Bannon and Kash Patel, and they may be running the FBI. Those are the shiny objects. But the movement is propelled by this hatred of the Democratic Party and the media elites, but also a promise to deliver on the economy, on immigration. And the people in charge of those two things, one of them is an alleged child sex trafficker, and the other is, by her own telling, a dog killer. I mean, the competence may be where he gets sort of bollocksed up.
I think that the idea of the authoritarian promise is that everything shrivels in government other than the will of the leader, right? So you don't necessarily put a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of HHS because you're hoping for great things from HHS. I mean, Matt Gaetz, among all the other things we can say about Matt Gaetz, he has explicitly proposed abolishing the Justice Department, not specifically just abolishing the FBI and the ATF, but talking about abolishing the Justice Department. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, as the Director of National Intelligence, the idea that Tulsi Gabbard, in a normal circumstance, could get a security clearance to be like a Walmart-style greeter at any U.S. intelligence agency, let alone get past the security barriers, is insane. So you do that because you want the worst for these agencies, because you want the worst for the U.S. government, because you think that the U.S. government is worthless. That's part of consolidating power, to make the U.S. government nothing other than the leader and people who will do what he says. And there not being any repository of expertise, let alone, just general day-to-day know-how anywhere. So it's a sort of, I mean, as Steve Bannon used to say, it's a sort of Leninist project, right? Destroy the state. This is the cabinet that you nominate to not to run the U.S. government to do anything, but to destroy the U.S. government, so that the U.S. government can be fundamentally reimagined as something much more like a unitary, authoritarian, or autocratic, for lack of a better term, system.
What are you looking at as the friction points? I mean, in the first Trump presidency, it was the firing of Jim Comey after he refused to, quote, see to it to let Mike Flynn go. Let Mike Flynn go. Comey says no. Trump embarks on a 4-year-long crusade against the FBI and the Department of Justice. To your point, Matt Gaetz is going to be in charge of the department, and an as yet named person expected to replace his last handpicked head of the FBI, Christopher Wray. He's sort of threatened Jerome Powell, who said it's illegal for him to replace me. I mean, where do you expect any friction between Trump 2.0 and the institutions that stand?
Well, the first one is going to happen over the question not of the appointment of any particular nominee, not of the confirmation process for any particular nominee, but whether there will be a confirmation process for nominees, right? The first point of confrontation is going to be between Trump and the Republican-controlled Senate, and it's going to be over the basic question of whether or not the Senate has any role in confirming any of these nominees, right? Trump will have to go to very arcane, very, very unusual and untested corners of the Constitution and precedent to find any way that he can shut down the House and the Senate himself. He's going to tell Republicans in Congress to shut themselves down, thus marginalizing themselves as one of the three supposedly co-equal branches of government, so that he can set up the executive branch himself without anybody having a say about it. Now, why would you want to do that rather than just have all of your nominees confirmed by the Senate, which I'm sure the Republicans in the Senate would be happy to do? You want them not to have a role in the confirmation process because you want the legislative branch to shrivel. You want the legislative branch to go away, because what authoritarians do is they consolidate power both within the executive and then in the person of the authoritarian leader. And so that's why it's an advantage to get a recess appointment rather than a Senate confirmed appointment, even if he's guaranteed Senate confirmation for even the craziest of these folks. And I think that confrontation will be first as to whether or not Congress essentially folds and becomes something like what Troy Nehls wants rather than what the founders intended, which was a